And Lud being interested in conspiracy theories, Lud, I suggested that there were 6 people I know that pretty much established were assassinated by the U.S. government. They were JFK, RFK, and MLK. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his brother Robert, and of course the great Dr. Martin Luther King. I also knew from CIA that Jimmy, Janice, and Jim had been assassinated. The great Jimi Hendrix, the great Janis Joplin, and the great Jim Morrison, for whatever reasons that the CIA and other agencies were viewing them as domestic terrorists, if you will. But then Lud and I began talking and suggesting maybe it's been 10,000 people since World War II have been victims of government assassination efforts. And I said to Lud, well, what about Arthur Koestler and his wife? And he said, why do you say that? And I said, well, you were talking about people who've been assassinated. It could be as many as 10,000 Americans or world citizens. Well, what about the Koestlers? And he said, Sally, please come into the room. And so Lud Aaron said, Andy, will you repeat yourself? And I said, Sally, Lud and I were talking about the issue of assassinations, and I was suggesting that maybe that's how Arthur Koestler and his wife died in that murder-suicide. And then Lud said, well, where did you find out about that? And I said, I read about it in like Time or Newsweek over at the Undergraduate Research Library at UCLA, now the Charles E. Young Library, named for the then chancellor of UCLA when I was a student, 1980 to 84. And he said, Sally, did you hear that? And she said, I most certainly did. So what I found out is that I was speaking about something that wouldn't happen yet. And it wasn't a psychic event or a premonition. I remembered, and I explained to the Aarons how I remember going in to the UCLA Undergraduate Library and reading about the death of the Koestlers. The problem was it wasn't time yet. This was Halloween of 1982, and I know it is because Fuller's interview with me had been published that year, a year after I did the interview with Bucky. But the Koestlers wouldn't die, or at least their death wouldn't be reported until like March 1st of 83. So I wasn't just giving a psychic impression that I had some sense that the Koestlers would be victims of supposedly a murder-suicide. I remembered, and I told the Aarons, no, I remember going over to the research library and their death was being reported. Now, the interesting thing is on my way over to the library, I was very hot. I had like a fever. But the bottom line is I had a time slip to the future. Being on the UCLA campus as an undergraduate, that was 5 months ahead of time. That has to be the only explanation. I wasn't mistaken that it was the Koestlers. Arthur Koestler, of course, was the famous writer of Darkness at Noon, and a book called The 13th Tribe, suggesting that the Jewish people, the modern Ashkenazis, were Khazarians, which they were not, by the way. Only about 5% of Jewish men have any Khazarian blood. So Kessler's basic brief on the Jewish people was simply not true. But I think probably his most famous book was Darkness at Noon. And I knew it was Arthur Koestler being written about. I knew it was a murder-suicide involving Mrs. Koestler. I knew when I had read it. It was before I went over to the Aarons rental condominium in Marina del Rey. So it was before Halloween, before October 31st of 82. I knew I had interviewed Fuller in October of 81. And I sold it to We for, I think it was about $750. It was my first major placement of one of my works of journalism in a mainstream magazine. So the Aarons wanted to meet me after reading it and ask me questions about Fuller. When I was there, I found that Ludd was, during that meeting with them, I remembered that he had taped my interview, my audio tape with Bucky Fuller, and he had other audio tape interviews. I noticed on his dresser in the living room, he had an interview with John Lennon of the Beatles, great luminary in his own right of his time. And then later, a number of years later, he said, Andy, I never recorded your interview with Fuller. And I said, Ludd, I remember that happening. He said, nope. And I said, did you have an audio tape interview with John Lennon? It was on your shelf. And he said, no, I never had an interview with Lennon. So this was what I call the problem of indeterminacy. Not only had I talked about a time slip to the future where Arthur Kessler and his wife were victims of like a murder or murder-suicide, either taking care of them, killing themselves or assassination victims, but even the substrates of what happened when I met with Ludd and Sally Aarons on Halloween, October 31st of 1982, did not correspond with our subjective memories. And this is going on a lot. And as an attorney admitted for the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington, and at the state level with the Washington State Bar Association, I have encountered this again and again and again. As an oral historian at UCLA, 1985 to 88, we would interview co-participants in the same event and get entirely discrepant outcomes. One time, I remember we interviewed 3 veterans of the Normandy invasion, right? June 6, 1944. One said the Bandoliers arrived that morning. Another veteran said that afternoon. And the third gentleman that we interviewed said, no, that was one of our problems with Normandy and why we lost 6,000 guys. The Bandoliers were never delivered to Normandy, at least for several days until the invasion was already a success. But man, we lost a lot of soldiers in pursuit of that. So the bottom line is that the Kesslers would die, but 5 months later, and it wasn't a premonition, it wasn't a psychic performance, it was a memory of when I had read it. What does that mean? Now, regarding that time in my life when I was going to Mars, one of my fellow astronauts, William Whitecrow, told somebody, because somebody mentioned to me, but I don't remember who it was, that all of us who were going to Mars were going back and forth between 2 adjacent timelines. That maybe was what was being exploited in Project Mars, induced time slips. So they could, for example, send us to Mars with what we've all remembered, which was an elevator. How does an elevator get sent to Mars?
Right.
How could it even happen, and how could it happen so quickly? We were getting to Mars in anywhere from about 10 to 20 minutes. And how do you send somebody to another planet using an elevator inside an office building in greater Los Angeles County? It was El Segundo, right? 999 North Sepulveda. So, but Whitecrow said, listen, we were all on 2 adjacent timelines when we were going to Mars. So I believe the notion of time slips, the use of alternative timelines, if you will, or dimensions, is being used by our government in ways that have not been explained to us. If they are, this would explain some of these occasional accidental time slips. But number 2, by no means in terms of rank, but just the one I'm talking about second, is what I call the Arthur Kessler incident. How did I remember reading about the death of Arthur Koestler, the great Hungarian-born Jewish novelist, the author of the great Darkness at Noon, one of the great anti-communist works of the 20th century. How did I find out about their deaths before they happened and be treating them as a fait accompli? I give you my word of honor, it was not a psychic event. Because I remembered going there to the UCLA undergraduate research library and reading about it, like in the milestones section of Time magazine or maybe Newsweek, where they report different events that have happened in the intervening week. So that's number two. I have no explanation for it.
Let me just put something in here for a second. It's interesting because from my point of view, as you're talking about this, it brings up the possibility that perhaps there are no psychic events in the first place.
It's certainly possible.
They're all possibly time slips. The reason I say it is because when a person is listening to this or watching it, of course they're forming all kinds of possible arguments and things like that as you're going along. We all do that. But we all basically adhere to one thread. And that thread is that there is one timeline that goes from the past to the present to the future. But when a person begins talking about the concepts that you're talking about, it is not very easy to accept it, because if what we're talking about is possible, then the problem is that where does reality exist? And of course, I'm leading to the fact that we really depend on the idea that we believe in this postulate that there's past, present, and future. If we start believing in the fact that there are many pasts, many presents, and many futures, it makes everything really, really hard to accept. Or if you accept it, then the process or the, I don't know, I'm going to say reality, which we like to have become really big and important and frozen in a sense, begins to fall apart. And if that begins to fall apart, then everything begins to fall apart.
Well, wait a minute, Bruce.
Sure.
In reality, the previous view of quantum physics, I'm going to be getting into this, but
okay.
The previous view of quantum physics, if two people in a common experience, either if they both disagreed about what happened, the previous view of quantum physics was either that they were both wrong or one was wrong and one was right. The new model is that both could disagree and both be right.
Right.
Which is tantamount from information coming in from our leading physicists. The Michio Kakus, the Ron Malletts, the Stephen Hawkings, the David Deutsches of Oxford, that in fact we do not share a common reality. And we always knew that, because look, if two friends say they went to college together, right? And they occasionally met on campus, had a conversation, and then friend number 3 came along and friend number 1 left and went to class. It's not really true that they went to the same experience when they went to college together. They had only a semi-overlapping reality.
Okay.
As in fact Buckminster Fuller opined. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we always kind of knew that reality was only semi-overlapping, and there was no shared experience, at least completely. But now quantum physics is actually deciding, it's actually theorizing that both could be talking about a different shared experience, have different versions of the same shared event, and both be right. And if that means that you're saying we're being too open-minded, in fact, we're not being open-minded enough. we should say, well, it didn't happen to me, but it could have happened to the other person.
Well, here's an example. Let me just stop for a second. Here's an example. I recently had a remote viewer that I did an interview with, and we were talking about the fact that in the remote viewing, even when he had like a really successful hit, which means that he saw something that really did happen, and he had the sketch that showed that he had found all of the different objects that were important to the remote view. But he said, the only thing I don't understand is why were these objects in different places? And I said, I believe it's because if the time-space continuum really isn't as location involved, for example, not only is there a past, present, and future, but let's just say the somewhat present. Everyone expects the same locations for certain things. Now, I don't want to get too much into this because I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I'm just trying to say one of the premises here is that your house and my house are going to be in the same place all the time. When we visit each other and all that, we expect that. What we don't expect is something you mentioned before in your first story, and that is, I go to your house and it's not there, it's somewhere else. You can't find my house because the last time you were there, it was in this area, and now it's not there. So that's a very important part of the entire thread. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I didn't mention it on this show, or didn't plan to mention it, but I knew somebody who had a brain disease, and when he was released from the hospital, it wasn't just a matter of a house in his neighborhood being torn down. It had never been there. Mm-hmm. So that begs the question, what is reality?
Right.
Did this person not remember that tearing down that house because he had an aneurysm or that brain disease? I'm forgetting what it's called, where you have a brain infection. But the bottom line was he checked with all the other neighbors, and it had never been there. It wasn't there when he was taken to the hospital. So perception does matter, but that's why we have to ask regarding these time slips, is it just a perceptual deficit or mistake, or is it something that's validated by numerous people? Certainly the Montelimar time slip and the Arthur Kessler event, which was a time slip to the future, involved myself and Ludd and Sally Aarons, and for that matter, the two Kesslers as subjects of the time slip, at least involved 3 people, but implicated 5. I have a third one to show that this one is another example that could not have been a perceptual mistake or deficit or something attendant to a disease of the brain. This one comes from the great broadcaster Gary Anderson. Gary has told it on several shows that I've been on, so I believe I can kind of talk out of class here and share this story with others. Gary definitely wants it known. He lives in Gig Harbor, Washington, and he was traveling with his children to Rainier, Washington. They stopped at a restaurant. His kids were still young enough to say, "Hey, Dad, look at all these neat old cars here at the restaurant." And when they came out, they had lunch, I presume, possibly dinner. And they came out and they were still in the time of that place, but they were all old cars in the parking lot. So Gary says he thought that maybe they were people who were participating in an antique car show in the neighborhood and just stopped by because this was a great restaurant to have lunch or dinner at.